science. You know, there are many questions people have as to how far we can delve into scientific research and still hold to a system of ethics. Some have no scruples as long as it's in the common good of mankind. But let me ask, what is that common good, and at whose expense may that be? We're going to be taking a look at many issues tonight, issues like dealing with embryonic stem cell research, the use of fetal body parts from aborted babies in vaccines, the creation of human embryos for experimentation. We'll also be talking about genetic screening and even those who are trying to have designer babies, gene editing, cloning, artificial wombs, three-parent embryos, human-animal hybrids. What about the use of AI tools in all of this as well? So we've got a lot to break down this evening, and also to just inquire if there are ethical guidelines to keep us from going too far. Joining us tonight, we would like to welcome to In Focus. A guest was on many years ago with us, and we're pleased to have him back, Dr. David Prentice. He is a president and founding board member of SALT, that's the Science Alliance for Life and Technology. Almost 50 years of experience as a scientific researcher, professor, academic leader, and policy advisor. He is a former advisory board chair and a founding member for the Midwest Stem Cell Therapy Center. He's got an earned PhD in biochemistry from the University of Kansas, and has provided scientific lectures and policy briefings and legislative testimonies in multiple states in some 21 countries around the world, testifying before the U.S. House and Senate, and also before multiple parliaments around the world. He was appointed in the year 2020 to by the Secretary of HHS to the Federal Human Fetal Tissue Ethics Advisory Board, has published numerous peer-reviewed scientific and bioethic articles on multiple scientific disciplines. I could probably read another half hour as to his accomplishments, but Dr. Prentice, so good to have you with us here tonight.
Good to be back with you, Jim.
Great. And also joining us here in studio is Dr. Tara Sander Lee. She's also a founding board member of SALT. Again, that's Science Alliance for Life and Technology. She is a science advisor and consultant who earned her PhD in biochemistry from the Medical College of Wisconsin. Some 30 years of experience in public policy, academic research, and clinical medicine, an emphasis on the cause of pediatric disease. She's provided policy advice to legislators and to state legislative bodies, the U.S. Congress as well. And she was a member of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Secretary's Advisory Committee on Infant and Maternal Mortality. And her training includes a fellowship in cell and molecular biology from Harvard Medical School and from Boston Children's Hospital. Also appointed faculty member at the Medical College of Wisconsin. Served as scientific director for molecular diagnostics at Children's Hospital of Wisconsin. And she has also published in various medical journals. And Dr. Tara Sander Lee, good to have you here as well.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
And both of you, many accolades as to your accomplishments, and congratulate you both and your dedication really to this issue that has brought us to this point of the developing of SALT, this Science Alliance for Life and Technology. But Dr. Prentice, you're a founding member of this, and just wondering if you could give us an overview of this organization, because for many people, this is going to be the first time they're hearing of it.
That's right. And you know, people should, number one, check out our website. It's salt4life.org, salt4life.org. But a bunch of friends, a bunch of scientists, and a couple of policy experts thrown in who were looking at these issues, challenges I call them, that we see nowadays, growing challenges for our culture, for our faith as well. And as scientists, we believe that good science, ethical science, is necessary. But facing all these challenges, we realized there needed to be some sort of united voice speaking into the culture. As SALT, we want to season the debate, if you will, with truth about the value of every human life.
Dr. Sander Lee, how do you see science shaping our future?
I see science shaping our future in wonderful ways because as we explore the world around us, the creation that God has given us, science offers incredible promise to heal the human condition. We know that. We see that every day, right? In hospitals, in clinics that are helping people meet them where their need is. But science is going to fail if advancements are going to rely on the intentional destruction or harm to human life. So I see that science has incredible promise, but we also need guardrails in place to be able to say there is a right and ethical way to do this where no human being can be harmed at any stage of life.
So how do we determine what is ethical and what is not ethical?
So we determine that by saying, is this science, can it progress and advance in a way that no human life can be harmed? So one example is in the case of, let's say, in vitro fertilization or in research, right? So let's just talk research. So what tools are we going to use? What means are we going to use to actually answer questions and do research? If any of that relies on the exploitation, the manipulation, the use of any human beings that are going to be intentionally destroyed or discarded, like embryonic stem cells, like embryos at any stage, or fetuses that were intentionally destroyed by abortion, that's exploiting human beings that have been intentionally harmed or destroyed. Where on the other side, where ethically we can do it, where there has been consent, there has been actual consent from a living donor to give consent to use like adult stem cells, there are clear guardrails where harm is either where harm is done intentionally or harm is not done intentionally.
Right.
That's really where it becomes pretty clear.
So let's talk through some of the many issues. And Dr. Prentice, I know some decades ago you were in Focus with me and talking about embryonic stem cell research. And I mean, you've got decades of experience in understanding this. So I think it would be important for us to, first of all, identify what is a stem cell and when we talk about embryonic stem cell research, what exactly are they doing to embryos? I mean, this is harming life, is it not?
It's definitely harming life. In fact, let's back up first. What's a stem cell? Well, it's a cell that has the flexibility to form lots of different types of tissues and organs and specialized cell types. So, when we were an embryo at that stage of development, as we grew and developed in our mother's womb, our stem cells at that point were starting to specialize into different types of more specialized tissue, whether that was bone marrow, whether that was blood, whether that was neural tissue, and so on. Embryonic stem cell research relies on the purposeful destruction of that young human life. Maybe only 5 to 7 days old, but that's still a living human being with value and dignity that should be respected. And instead, what the stem cell researchers did was kill that young being, put her cells into the dish in the hopes, and we kept hearing this language for years and years, that they had the potential to cure various diseases and so on. Well, one of the problems is the ethical problem. You had to destroy a young human being just to get those cells to do the research. The other unethical part was the false promises that were given. There were millions of people that were promised they would have their disease or their condition treated by these embryonic stem cells. And you and I were discussing before we came on the air the idea we used to have a scoreboard in terms of number of different diseases or conditions treated, and eventually it became number of different individual human beings who had been treated. And the score was and remains 0 for embryonic stem cells. But there are ethical alternatives, adult stem cells. Listeners probably have heard about bone marrow transplants. Well, nowadays we call those stem cell transplants, but those are adult stem cells. You can take them from a donor or use your own cells. You don't destroy the donor when you take them. And those adult stem cells actually also show remarkable flexibility in terms of being able to repair and replace damaged tissue, to even turn into some other types of cells. And in terms of that scoreboard we mentioned, 0 lives saved or cured with embryonic stem cells. The count is now over 2 million human beings who have benefited from adult stem cells. The ethical science is also the successful science.
You know, and that's what's so amazing in all of this is the fact that there have not been any promises. I mean, I heard the word you said, Dr. Prentice, and it has the potential, you know, for this. But this is something, Dr. Prentice, that potential has. That word is still out there. There's never been a cure or benefit that we're seeing from the use of destroying human life for, you know, researching the stem cells. Correct?
That's correct. And you know, it's not to say that if they continue to pour money and time and lives, because that's the key problem here with embryonic stem cell, that they might get some sort of halfway thing, but there's never been an actual cure, an actual success with embryonic stem cells. And we promote ethical science like the adult stem cells. And our position is you ought to take all of that funding that you're giving to this unethical embryonic stem cell research, give it to adult stem cell research and other ethical alternatives, which are really going to put the patient first and benefit many lives without destroying the stem cell donor.
Yeah, isn't that the definition of insanity?
I know.
Dr. Senator Lee, you know, that where we continue to it would pour money in and there's not that anything that is coming from it, but we continue to do this. Are we still providing funds, federal funds for this, or are these private funds? Is that embryonic stem cell research going on in universities?
So with embryonic stem cell research, what has happened is that the NIH created what was called an embryonic stem cell line. So for every human embryo that was destroyed, they created a line, okay? And so it was like a cell line that they could research then. And so what happened is that they would use federal funding to fund research grants that could go in and actually get access to those embryonic stem cell lines and do research. But right now, I'm very excited to say that the NIH is reviewing that, and they actually asked for public comment because they put a pause on all of that federal funding because they want people to comment, and those comments were just due about a week ago. They are exploring whether they should stop all federal funding for embryonic stem cells. So in answer to your question, right now there is a pause on doing embryonic stem cell research using these cell lines, but but public funds and private funds can be used to create and to destroy human embryos and to do research with them. But as Dr. Prentice said, it's this potential that it might lead to something, but after years and years of research, we see that no therapies have come out of it. We see the same with aborted fetal tissue. We say that money has been poured into it, but again, no treatment or therapies have been produced after over a century of studies. But again, the NIH has also put an end to that funding, which is fantastic.
It is fantastic, but why would those who are privately funding this continue to pour money in when the promise is on adult stem cell research?
Because I think they can. I think that's what happens a lot of times in science, because they can do it and they're going to just keep on trying, and they live with this false hope that something's good can come out of it, but they are ignoring all these more successful alternatives that Dr. Prentice talked about, the adult stem cells, the induced pluripotent stem cells. There are now organoids that are like organ-like tissues that you can grow in a dish that don't rely on any unethical cell lines if they're created, you know, ethically. So there are many ethical alternatives, and they are just ignoring it. And I think it's because they don't see. I think that's what it comes down to. They don't see the dignity in human life. We know that there's a lot of lies and misconceptions out there where they're just ignoring it and saying, "Well, this isn't a real human being, right? At any age." Prior to birth, like that somehow the baby just became a human being at birth, you know, so they think that they can use these human beings as a form of exploitation in research, and it's just absolutely wrong.
So for the record, Dr. Prentice, when does life begin?
at conception, at fertilization, under normal circumstances. We'll talk, I'm sure, about some of these newer and stranger ways that people are trying to make embryos. But at that point where the sperm and egg fuse, you no longer have cells, you have a human being, an organism. Even at one cell stage, this is a human being, a human organism. That's the scientific fact. And scientists have known this for decades and decades. It's a matter of recognizing that and giving that young human being his or her due, realizing their value and dignity.
Let's hit another issue, and that is the use of fetal body parts in the matter and the developing of vaccines. That is happening as well, Dr. Prentice?
It has happened unfortunately, for decades. There's a lot of misinformation out there in terms of that. For example, your listeners might hear that, oh, the polio vaccine was made using aborted baby body parts, or fetal cell lines, then they call it. Simply not true. The polio vaccine and most vaccines actually have been made without using aborted baby cells and organs. But there are still some vaccines that are used, that are created using these fetal cells and fetal body parts. They actually started back in about the 1960s. There were some people who decided they wanted to just grow fetal cells in the dish, and then they said, well, we could make vaccines using those cells. And there was sort of a groundswell, if you will, during the 60s, 70s, maybe even into the 1980s, if we're going to make these cells from aborted babies, and then we're going to use them for experiments, which didn't turn out. Maybe we'll transplant them. Well, that didn't work at all, but we can make some vaccines with them. The number has gone down since that time, and the last time I checked, it was down out of somewhere around 90 different vaccines that are FDA approved in the United States. There are only a handful left, maybe 9 or so, but the pharmaceutical companies are still hanging on to this, frankly, medieval technique in terms of making the vaccines. And we would encourage them to do a public service and learn how to make their vaccines out of ethically derived cells, whether from adults or other donors or even animal cells. These can all be used and have been used for most vaccines. A good example is actually that polio vaccine. For a while, some companies made polio vaccine using these fetal cell lines, again from aborted baby's tissue, but a couple of them changed, in the early 2000s. And people were saying, no, it won't work, it's too bad, you shouldn't do that. Well, it turned out not only did it work when they moved away from the fetal cell lines, it actually worked better.
Very interesting. So are those fetal cell lines, are they used in the actual vaccination itself, or is it testing the vaccination, that testing process?
So there are a handful of vaccines that actually use the human fetal cell lines themselves. So like the chickenpox vaccine, the rubella, hepatitis A. We know that when some of the original COVID vaccines were made, there were a couple, like the Johnson & Johnson, which is no longer available, that was using the fetal cell lines. So yes, there are a handful. But a majority of the vaccines, especially if they don't use them to make, if they don't use the fetal cell lines to actually produce and make them, often there is some they are tainted in that they have been used to test. So we saw that even with the COVID-19 vaccine. So like the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, even though they use the mRNA technology, which didn't require using fetal cell lines to produce them, they still use those fetal cell lines to test them in some of the research and development process. So that's why they're so embedded deep within the research.
And it's not just this, but I understand even that there are different products, food products that they were using
to
the
test.
cell lines to test flavorings and so forth.
Yes, that's absolutely
How
true.
bizarre.
It is. And so that's, and like Dr. Brennan said, it's very medieval. It is very entrenched in the research labs. I can tell you from my own research lab that you couldn't throw a stone anywhere down the lab or somebody didn't have them in their freezer. So they're very common, and we would love to see them all go away because they're not needed.
Yeah.
They're not needed.
Let's hit another, we got a lot of topics here tonight, and let's bring up the matter of genetic screening and designer babies.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, that sounds Frankensteinish in a way.
Yes.
But that practice is being conducted, is it not?
Yes, it is. So if we start with in vitro fertilization, so couples that are struggling with infertility that will go forward and will we'll approach a reproductive medicine clinic to go through the process of in vitro fertilization, where the embryos are generated outside of the womb in a dish, and then transfer back into the woman. But let's say hypothetically they produce more than they can transfer in one time.
Which is usually the case.
Especially if it's a younger couple. So they could hypothetically have somewhere between 10 and 20 embryos, and they're trying to decide which embryos should they transfer first, which ones should they freeze, and maybe come back to later. What is a very common technique is what's called pre-implantation genetic testing, in which they genetically screen these embryos by taking a small biopsy very early on in the embryo. It's only about 5 days old. And they screen the embryo for any diseases that are genetically based, okay? But then not only do they do that, there are a handful of companies that are looking at what's called polygenic diseases that are very complex, and even the environment and diet play a role into whether these diseases even manifest, right? Like type 2 diabetes or Alzheimer's. So what's happening is that we see that there's this big push to screen these embryos for disease at just a single gene disorder, but also very complex diseases, and now even traits. They're screening these embryos for intelligence, for eye color, for hair color, and so they're selling this to couples that this is your way to choose your best baby. This with great genes. And then what's happening is this whole nother field of, okay, so now that, let's say you have an embryo that has a disease. Now now they're trying to optimize the techniques. Well, let's try to figure out a way if we can genetically engineer that baby to just change and tweak their DNA to make it the baby we want. So this is the world that we're living in.
So gene editing?
Gene editing.
My.
Yes.
And how, Dr. Prentice, how is it that a person, what kind of tests can they know the intelligence of what this baby would be?
Well, there's the catch, Jim. They can't really know that. They have done enough studies, and there's so many different genes that are involved in something like intelligence or even something like height, that they think that if they have enough statistical evidence, they can maybe predict that. But there was one company that talked about, we could predict and maybe help you pick an embryo so that you could add maybe 4 IQ points if you picked that particular embryo. But statistically, that wasn't possible. The science is simply not there at that point. They're making, again, false promises, and they might get an embryo that has a slightly higher IQ, but they might get an embryo that's 20 IQ points down. So it's, again, trying to play God in terms of just screening these embryos in a way that is simply not able to fulfill the promises that they're selling.
This is so bizarre. I mean, doesn't this really open the door for lawsuits? I mean, from the
Yes.
what you said we were going to have blue eyes and blonde hair, or
Right.
you said that it was going to be this tall, and that my child is not that tall. That there was deception that was used in this. I mean, it just
Yeah.
seems to open the door for malpractice suits.
It is. And on top of that, it's saying, in the case of in vitro fertilization, where you're actually discarding and putting and casting children aside that have disease, you're basically saying, okay, we're going to eliminate disease by eliminating people. I mean, so this is turning into not only, like you said, a legal battle of like personhood and who owns these babies, and also how well are they actually predicting these traits, but it's also at a deeper level. This is so eugenic and wrong, because it's saying that somehow some people are better than other people.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And there are countries, Dr. Prentice, who have said, hey, we have cured the issue of not having Downs, Downs babies, born. It's because of the fact that they're murdering them.
Right. They didn't cure Down syndrome. They didn't somehow magically get rid of it. They got rid of the people.
Yeah.
Either they were aborted because they used these prenatal genetic tests, or after they were born. In some cases, there are instances we know of where these individuals were just set aside and allowed to die. But as Dr. Sandra Lee says, this is a new eugenics 2.0, if you wish. But now it's not just based on breeding. We're going to actually go to the molecular and the genetic level and do the screening. Or, as Dr. Sandra Lee says, companies now that are promising, well, you want to make this child more intelligent, or you want one that will be faster, maybe they can make the Olympics. What? We'll do some gene editing and try and make that designer baby. And let's look at also what's going on behind this. This is not for the benefit of the child. This is for the benefit of the adults who have a desire for the perfect baby, or one that's made in their own image.
Yeah, very interesting. Now, Dr. Sandra Lee, you mentioned the number of embryos created through IVF. What happens with the others that are not utilized?
So if a couple goes through in vitro fertilization, they really have 4 options. They can transfer that embryo directly into the woman for potential, life, for development, and then life and birth. Or they can freeze the embryo for later transfer. Or they can donate it to research, where it will absolutely be intentionally destroyed. As we mentioned, the embryonic stem cells are generated from those. Or it is just discarded and thrown away. So when we start looking at, and Dr. Prentice wrote an excellent article on the science and ethics of in vitro fertilization. And if you look at scientifically what we know about in vitro fertilization, even though it's a very highly unregulated business, but just conservative estimates are that over 90% of the embryos that are generated by in vitro fertilization die, because they are either intentionally destroyed through research or discarded, or they just die because there's so much manipulation that's happening to them, right? And then it's also, conservative estimates are that over 1.5 million embryos have been abandoned to the freezer in the United States.
And just sitting in cold storage.
Yes.
So on this issue, Dr. Prentice, there would be some who would say, but you're destroying hope. For some women, this is the only hope that they have for IVF. Why would you want to destroy somebody's hope?
If you're talking about foreclosing or at least foregoing IVF, and it's actually a selling point that the IVF industry has put out there, and it is an industry. These doctors are in it to make money, and it's, as Dr. Sandra Lee said, pretty much unregulated and so on. There's not necessarily full transparency of these numbers that she was talking about, or the manipulations, or the actual chance that you will take home a born baby. It also does away with looking at the real problems associated with infertility. IVF doesn't treat infertility. It's a technical workaround in the hopes that the couple will be able to have a baby to take home from the hospital. But ignoring those problems that underlie the root causes of infertility can actually set up problems later on for the parents, especially for mom. In the meantime, there's a series of techniques and procedures called restorative reproductive medicine, which actually delve into what are the root causes? Why is this couple infertile? What can we do to repair that problem and restore their fertility? And the studies that I've seen have shown that even in cases where IVF has failed couples in the past, the restorative reproductive medicine has restored their fertility and they were able to have babies. So we need to kind of turn away from the technological aspects that ignore the real problems and start looking at restoring fertility, not going around it.
Right. And I think also, you mentioned the number of these embryos that are in storage right now.
Right.
I think there are agencies been created for adopting these, is it snowflake adoptions?
Snowflake babies.
Snowflake babies. And is that an effective way of dealing with this situation?
Absolutely. So we know actually one of the, there's been a baby that was in the freezer for 30 years, and it was the oldest baby that was in the freezer that has now just been born. So so it is absolutely a real alternative that if a couple is struggling with infertility, they could, instead of adopting a baby after birth, they could adopt a baby as an embryo, and then they could transfer the baby, and then actually, if that woman is able, she could then give birth and have, be pregnant with that embryo. Well,
science. We want to do all kinds of things with science. We want to have that freedom in science. Let's talk about another aspect that's not pleasant to think about, but it's being done, is this three-parent embryos, three-person embryos. Dr. Prentice, give us a rundown of that issue.
Yeah, so what are they talking about doing there? Well, within all of our cells, including our very first embryo cell, single-celled embryo, we have these little energy factories called mitochondria. And we have our own genomic DNA that codes for all sorts of things for our bodies and for proteins and so on. But these mitochondria have a little bit of DNA of their own. DNA can be mutated, and so there are conditions where the DNA of these little energy factories is mutated. It can cause disease and so on, even fatal problems. So some people propose doing this. Well, let's just kind of replace those little batteries, those energy factories, with fresh ones. They actually aren't doing that in the three-parent embryo situation. What they do is they will take an egg from the mom who wants to have this baby but has the mutated mitochondrial DNA. They'll remove the nuclear DNA from that egg and put it into a healthy egg from another woman who doesn't have those mutations. So now you have an egg that has DNA from two different moms. It's actually a cloning procedure because you're transferring a nucleus. It's harking back to the early days of Dolly the sheep, if you will, in terms of transferring that DNA. Then they'll fertilize this hybrid egg, if you will. So now you've got two moms and a dad, which means you've got to send two Mother's Day cards now. But the idea is supposedly that you're getting away from these mutated DNA problems in the energy factories. The baby will simply be very healthy, no problems. There have already been some children born using this technique. It turned out they didn't totally eliminate all the mutation problems. And in fact, those mutations can continue to crop up in these new individuals. The other point, and I actually testified to an FDA committee on this, over a decade ago about whether they should proceed along this line. And they had on the panel a woman who had some of these DNA mutations in those little energy factories. And they were describing, oh, we could go through and do this 3-parent embryo thing. She goes, can't you do something that will actually help me instead of creating new individuals that you hope don't have that problem? In point of fact, we were actually able to convince some members of Congress to put a little piece of legislation in that says you can't do this kind of cloning genetic manipulation, which is what it is, in the United States. It's illegal to do it, and you'll get 10 years in prison. But the other side of this coin is, as the lady on the panel said, there are ways now to actually treat people that have those mitochondrial DNA mutations, to actually try to help them instead of tossing them aside and trying to come up with new people that we think are better.
Wow, there's a lot to this, and it's just, again, when there's no guardrails, there's many ways this goes. Let's bring up another topic, that is artificial wombs. Help us understand what's happening in this aspect.
Yeah, so what's happening in this aspect is that some babies are born extremely premature, okay? And so if they're given proper interventions in this country, some babies are surviving as early as 21 weeks gestation, just a little over half of the into pregnancy. It's remarkable, right? But what I think what people are trying to think of, okay, but let's say we can actually devise some type of artificial womb. If these babies are born extremely premature, maybe this could be a way that if they can't survive outside the womb, that we could use an artificial womb to kind of help them get through pregnancy. But and they've actually shown this in a sheep model, that this actually, this is something that is moving forward, and they're trying very actively in research to have this be potentially a real option for babies that are born extremely premature. But what's happening on the other side of this, very early in embryonic development, is that it's also called ectogenesis. So ectogenesis is any time you have a baby that is growing outside the womb, right? So in using these artificial wombs, you can maybe help to save a baby. But then you also have these other situations where they're actually making human embryos. They're called embryo models, and they're growing them outside the womb for as long as they can. And there's technology. I know Dr. Prentice is really on top of this, but there's like even ways that they're trying to generate an artificial womb where you can actually see the embryo implant. And so these are very unethical ways that they're trying to just generate human embryos to research at them and then destroy them.
Right,
so they want to create them, grow them, and then destroy them. And they want to use them as the way to try to understand disease, to try to generate organs for transplantation, right? So this is a very unethical way. So you have kind of on two sides of, you have people that are trying different ways to try to help, to try to grow embryos, but one is for a good reason, one is for a very bad reason.
Right. And you can see, well, we don't need mothers any longer. We don't need real human wombs to do this. We will just generate them ourselves.
Yeah, and I think, there was a study that just came out in time for Mother's Day. It was a beautiful study that just came out just to remind us how beautiful that bond is between the mother and her baby, and nothing can replace it. The study studied how babies yawn in the womb, and they showed, the studies examined how when a mother yawns in pregnancy, that her behavior then creates her baby to respond and then yawn after her. Right. So it was a beautiful study just reminding us of just that connection between the mother and the child, that bond that cannot be replaced by any artificial measure.
Right. Friends, tonight, as we're talking on this whole matter of life-affirming science, we do want to open our phone line here this evening and take your text as we're talking. We've got more topics this evening as well. But if you have a specific question about things we've even talked about so far, or on this topic of life-affirming science, our phone number for In Focus is 414-935-3030. 414-935-3030 or 1-800-733-8830. That's 800-733-8830. If you'd like to text in your question or brief comment, make sure that you give us your first name, the city that you're texting from, and go ahead with your comment or question that you would have for our guest. And you can use our text in line, which is 414-459-9638. That's 414-459-9638. And send your text, and we'll try to address your question that you have as well, if you'd like to send that in here this evening. But these are important issues that we'll be talking about, and the importance of having guardrails that are put up to keep us from going over the cliff, so to speak, and causing much harm and destruction. There is also the subject, Dr. Prentice, of human-animal hybrids. What is going on with this?
And this is another sort of weird science where people, part of it started because they thought, well, what would happen if? It was kind of that curiosity question, but also because they wanted to do human cloning, but they kept saying, oh, those mean old pro-lifers won't let us do that, so let's try and make something that we won't call human. The way they do this, there are various ways to do it, but they're combining the genetics and combining cells from humans and some animal species. One of their favorites is sheep, another is pigs, but they also do the typical sort of mouse-human chimera is the technical term, but it's a hybrid between the two species. And, in one way, people might say, oh, well, then it's not really human. Well, there's a question there, because if you combine the human genetics and the human cells early enough with the animal cells in an animal embryo, let's say, now the human cells could become any particular tissue in that developing hybrid. And so let's say they start to become brain tissue. So now you develop the animal that has the human brain. Or what about the animal that is producing human eggs or sperm? Or even one that produces a morphology that looks like a human. These would all be unethical types of hybrids or chimeras. You're blurring those species lines, and again, you don't need to do it. There are ethical, scientific ways to look at the scientific questions involved without crossing those ethical lines.
Right. And Dr. Sandra Lee, isn't this really a conflict even with what we see, the creation account in Genesis, where God created after its kind.
That's right.
To try and mix those kinds together, again, is something that is in defiance against God.
It is. And it's ignoring God. It's ignoring his law. It's not God honoring science. This is not a science that honors God. And like you said, it's going against what his original design, which is good, which is perfect. And that's what we're seeing in all of these strange scientific experiments, right? They're, as Dr. Prentice said, playing God, creating human beings in man's own image. And I also think what's happening too with like the genetic editing, one of the greatest tools that God created is DNA, and that to create that diversity that we see within the kinds, right? So within humankind, that's what makes us all special and unique. From the moment of conception, we have all the DNA that we need for life to make us exactly who he created us to be. And when we start to try to say, no, sorry, you didn't do a good enough job, we're gonna tweak it and do it ourselves. I think we're right back where we were with the Tower of Babel. We're trying to do it ourselves, and we're ignoring God and his glory, and it will fail. Yeah.
Dr. Prentice, hence SALT, Science Alliance for Life and Technology. You've formed your organization, bringing together wonderful professionals in addressing this, testifying before, the House, the Senate, parliaments around the world. Are people listening? Are those governing bodies, are they listening to what you have to say? Are they listening to the research? Are they saying, hey, we do need to put some strong guardrails into place?
Yeah, Jim, I think they are listening. Now, SALT is fairly new. We're not even actually a year old as a formal organization. But the people that make up the Science Alliance for Life and Technology have really over 200 years cumulative experience doing those kinds of testimonies, writing the scientific papers, but also writing the publicly accessible things. And several things that have happened recently testify to the fact that they are listening. So Dr. Sanderly mentioned before that they've now put a pause on federal funding of human embryonic stem cell research. This is something that we've been fighting against for literally decades, but the folks within the Science Alliance for Life and Technology actually has two of the folks, only two, who have ever sued NIH and HHS to stop human embryonic stem cell research. So we've been working on this for a long time. They are finally starting to listen. They've stopped federal funding of aborted baby body parts, the fetal tissue types of research. They're looking at enhancing the amounts of funds that are given to life-affirming types of research, like adult stem cell research. We mentioned before the idea that it's now illegal to do these sort of genetic tweaks in the U.S. to try to make designer babies. So there's a lot of things and a lot of challenges that we continue to work on, but we're encouraged by what has happened just recently. And I think SALT has had an impact in the past and will continue to have a great impact.
Indeed. Friends, our telephone number tonight, 414-935-3030. Give us a call here tonight with your questions on our topic this evening. If you want to text, you may call, use our text line, 414-459-9638. I have a text from Sandy in Milwaukee. It says, do you have any facts or studies on the percentage of patients and embryos that are harmed during the IVF process? And if you don't have facts or studies, do you have a sense of the percentage?
Yeah, so we do know that from, as we said earlier, it's a pretty unregulated business, but we do know just from the scientific studies that over 90% of the human embryos are going to die and be harmed just from IVF. So we know that it is a pretty common procedure. Well over 12 million babies have been born by in vitro fertilization. So just based on that number alone, with over 90% of the embryos that we know end up dying, that means that over 100 million embryos, at the minimum, have died to date. So that's even more than the number of abortions that occurred. So this is a serious problem, and that's just talking in vitro fertilization alone. That's not even talking all the embryos that have died just in research laboratories and the creation and the manipulation, the exploitation, and the destruction of all of these embryo experiments.
So we often will hear, well, if it's in the common good for mankind, then we should go ahead and do this. We should go ahead and go down this road. How do we balance that to the common good of mankind, Dr. Prentice?
Well, back to our original question of what we would say would be unethical research, and that would be anything that involves harm or destruction of a human life, even at the earliest stages of life. And again, we keep mentioning these alternatives, but I think that's the hopeful part of this is we don't have to go down those unethical lines of research. And in fact, if you look at the evidence over the years and over the decades, the research that involves destruction of human life, whether it's with aborted fetal tissue, whether it's with human embryonic stem cells, whether it's with these human-animal chimera mixtures, none of them, and that's zero, have resulted in any cures, whereas the ethical, the life-affirming research, like adult stem cells and some of these other things that we've mentioned, these are the ones that have shown success. And as I mentioned before, now over 2 million people successfully treated, their health helped with adult stem cells. We've got other types of ethical stem cells and ethical treatments. Look at the gene editing field. The idea that you're going to create the designer babies that we've been discussing by altering human embryos and doing that gene editing versus the actual successes they've had treating somebody after they're born with genetic therapies, where they have already treated successfully things like sickle cell anemia and certain types of blood diseases and cancers. So, if we focus on what the life-affirming and life-honoring types of research are, that's where we're going to see the success.
Yeah. Let's bring up another aspect of this too, and we are just seeing the rapid development take place of artificial intelligence. How is AI impacting the issues we're talking about here tonight?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we're seeing that, especially in the case of in vitro fertilization, artificial intelligence is being used as a way to basically overanalyze the entire process from beginning to end. So to use machine learning as a way to very early on in the in vitro fertilization process even examine the sperm, right? Examine the woman's eggs. When we were talking about the genetic screening that is happening before implantation, we're seeing that artificial intelligence is being used to actually, when they take the biopsy from the embryo and do the genetic testing, then that artificial intelligence is being used to analyze the genome and compare it to all the other genomes where we know where there's evidence where that person has like that disease. So they basically compare all these genomes. The artificial intelligence compares the genomes very quickly. So AI is being used to try to recognize and predict patterns that we can't see with the human eye. But it is not going to be fail-proof, right? It is going to make mistakes. We know just even from AI being used in this, determine these polygenic risk scores, which are used to predict like these, again, complex diseases like Alzheimer's and stuff, or the traits like intelligence, right? We know that it doesn't do a very good job because you have to have databases that are actually statistically have enough power, and we know that we don't have the statistical power to be able to do that. We know we don't have, especially for those that are minority populations, we don't have enough data to be able to even predict that within the minority population. So it's not going to be foolproof.
Yeah, and we've turned AI into God.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
That's what's going on. Dr. Prentice, this is a question from Jacob in Hartford. He says, if the adult cells are better than fetal cells, why is there such resistance to switching? Is there a lot of lobbying money coming from Planned Parenthood and other organizations in abortion industry to keep fetal cells in use in order to protect their own revenues gained from selling the cells?
And I think the short answer would be yes, there is lobbying in there. We know, for example, that Planned Parenthood and some of the other abortion providers basically were selling aborted fetal tissue and aborted fetuses, the whole body. David Daleidon's undercover videos that exposed this horrific practice and trafficking in it. And Salt was also trying to point that out early on. We wrote this very large review paper trying to cover all of those aspects. And the other thing you find out is it's not just the provider, if you will, that are selling these aborted babies and their bodies, but it's also the researchers who, if they can get money to do this, they're going to do that. And so, they are also lobbying for this to continue. So it's a good sign, as we mentioned, that, now they've cut off aborted fetal tissue research at the federal level. They are looking to cut off human embryonic stem cell research at the federal level. And I'm sure we'll hear a lot of whining and crying from scientists going, oh, you're going to stop us finding cures and so on. That is simply not true because, again, There are virtually zero cures and treatments that have come from that unethical research. Where we see benefit is from the ethical research. And so I'd encourage your listeners to give a little call to their state and their federal elected representatives and put in a little lobbying for the good and the ethical and successful science.
And I think that's important because we hear all of our discussion tonight and talking about some very deep issues that are going on, and strong morals and ethics and upholding the sanctity of human life and all this. And say, okay, you both have your doctorates and well learned in the sciences, but what can I do as an individual? How can I get engaged? And I think you're starting to hit on that, Dr. Prentice. We need to reach out to our legislators to put those guardrails. Are they the decision makers in this?
Well, they're some of the decision makers, but it's also our citizenry who are the real decision makers. And so
we the people.
Yeah, we the people. We need to learn as a society about the difference between this unethical and unsuccessful research versus the life-affirming and the life-benefiting research. We need to tell our friends, our families, our schoolmates, and so on, folks we work with about it. And then we need to also push on our elected representatives, because they're the ones who are saying, okay, we'll make a law about this, or especially we'll give money to this or that, or not give money to this or that. And it's our taxpayer money that they're allocating. Right. So we need to tell them we want it spent on ethical science.
Dr. Sanderlee, you have a website to direct people to. We're dealing with a lot of these issues. Tell us about it.
Yes, so please go to our website. It's at Salt for Life, and that's number 4, so saltforlife.org. And we know that some of these issues can be very complex, so we really want to equip people so that they feel emboldened to go forward and share this information with other people, share it with their legislators, share it with their friends, because we're trying to keep people up to date on the most cutting edge science so that they know where that ethical line is being drawn and where no human life is being injured or where there is a real risk to human life.
And friends, if you have questions, you can write their questions into the website as well.
Please do, yes. Please sign up. You can go to our website. You can put in your email to stay informed. We'll provide you with our newsletters when they come out. You can put in a comment if you have any questions. So please reach out to us. We really want to help. We want to be a resource for you.
Dr. Sanderlee, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much.
And Dr. David Prentice, thank you as well for being with us here on the broadcast this evening and talk really about life-affirming science. It's very critical we go down this path and avoid that which is going to destroy life.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate you getting the truth out.
Great. Thank you both for being with us here tonight. And friends, Scripture upholds the sanctity of human life, fearfully and wonderfully made, the Bible tells us, and it's so critical that we choose life. God bless you, friends. Thanks for joining us on In Focus. Good night.
I loved systematic theology. It's the way my mind works. Essentially, systematic theology is how a lot of left-brain people think. You're saying, give me all the data on this topic that's available. Systematic theology breaks everything down into these categories. Biblical theology, in my mind, it was always like, well, all theology is biblical, right? As long as you're getting your theology from the Bible.
Welcome to the Creation Today Show, where we bring together interviews with experts and solid Bible teaching. Your host, Eric Hovind, affirms the ultimate authority of God's Word, the truth of creation, and why it matters to you.
What if the biggest misunderstanding in Christianity today isn't what the Bible says, but how we're reading it? Now, obviously, people have studied Scripture for generations, but not always in the same way. Some start with topics and build systems. Others start at the beginning and follow the story as it unfolds. And where you start could actually change what you're seeing. So when we open our Bible, are we listening to what God is saying, or are we just trying to organize it into subjects based on things that we've already been taught? Hey, if this is your first time joining us, welcome to the Creation Today Show. I'm your host, Eric Hovind. For more than 25 years now, I've been helping people walk through some of the toughest questions about science, faith, and truth, and showing that God's Word doesn't collapse under scrutiny. It stands even stronger. You can explore more of the content that we produce and connect with us at creationtoday.org. Guys, my guest today to talk about this conversation about how we read the Bible and how we study the Bible, well, he really needs no introduction to the Creation Today community because he's pretty much family over here. He's a familiar voice in the creation movement, and he's been seen on the Creation Today show for many years. He has been faithfully teaching, writing, and helping believers really stand firmly on the authority of God's Word. He's a speaker and author and content manager at Answers in Genesis, and he spent much of his life tackling the...
And the Son of God, Jesus the Lord, said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. Therefore, go into all the world, teaching and preaching the gospel to every single person at the remotest parts of the earth.
In Touch, the teaching ministry of Dr. Charles Stanley. Next on In Touch, how to love your mother.
Do you love your mother? Let me ask you this. Does she know you love her? What have you done to make her think you love her? Did you just tell her? Have you ever hurt your mother's feelings? Do you really and truly love her? And if someone walked up to you and said, well, tell me why you love your mother, what would you say? Would you say, well, because she's my mother? That's not a good answer. A lot of people think they love their mother, but they don't. They don't even know how. Many people do and are willing to pay the price, whatever's necessary to take good care of their mother. And so I think the best example of that is Jesus himself. And I want you to turn to John chapter 19. This little incident, which is not little, not just an incident, but a beautiful example of the kind of attitude we should have toward our mothers. You say, well, my mother's already gone to heaven. Well, so is mine. But you know what? Mothers today, no matter where your mother is, whether she's with you or she's in heaven, we thank God for them if they're in heaven, and we thank God for them if they're here. I think a lot of people honestly do not know how to treat their mother. And how many people have I heard say over the years, well, you know, if I'd have just realized I'd have done this for my mother and that for my mother, and I wouldn't have done this and I wouldn't have done that. Well, how do you love your mother? That's what I want to talk about in this message. And in this 19th chapter of John, it's a good example. And what's happening here, of course, Jesus has been crucified. And I want us to look, if you will, in the 25th verse, which says, therefore the soldiers did these things. Then, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Now that could be 3 or 4 women, depends upon how you interpret that. When Jesus then saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing thereby, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. From that hour the disciple took her into his own household. Now, you and I might ask the question, well, why didn't he say mom or mother? Why did he say woman? Well, the real true interpretation of that and the meaning of it is not just woman, but dear woman. This was his way of saying what he wanted to say to her. Now, why wouldn't he just say mother? Probably for 2 reasons. One of the 2 maybe, or maybe both. One of them is this. At that moment in his life, hanging there with being nailed to the cross, bleeding and dying with a few moments or maybe an hour or so to live, what he wanted her to do is to see him and to look upon him not only as her son, but the Messiah. He was God's son. God sent him to do exactly what he was doing. And probably thinking maybe that if she could look at him as the Messiah, not just her son, that it wouldn't be quite as painful as it was just to see Jesus. Because naturally she was thinking what any mother would have been thinking, looking at him. Thinking about when he was a little baby and how he was born. And born, she was a virgin, and holding him and feeding him and watching him grow up and remembering the things that he had said to her which she didn't quite understand. And now there it is. There he hangs on the cross. The most painful thing that a mother could possibly endure. And knowing this, that he'd been the perfect son. The rest of her kids weren't that way. The perfect son. Now he was hanging on the cross. And I believe in order to relieve some of her own emotional pain, he was saying to her, Mom, I'm God's Messiah. Remember that. While I'm your son, I'm the Messiah. And then to express his awesome love, he turned to her and said, looking at her, said, speaking of John, and then to John, behold your mother. What in the world was he saying? Here's what he was saying. Mom, I love you so much. I'm dying, I'm going to leave you, but I want you to know, I want to be sure you're taken care of for the rest of your life. And notice how he says this. Jesus then saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved, which was John, the writer of the gospel, because 3 times in the gospel he describes himself as the one whom Jesus loved. And so when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. I'm putting you in John's hands. And then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. I want you to take care of her. I'm trusting her into your hands. And from that day, the disciple took her into his own household. Now, we don't really know exactly what happened to Mary, except that 2 ideas that have been put forth. One of them is that John took her home to his home in Jerusalem, where she lived approximately 11 years, and then she passed away. And John started his ministry among the Gentiles. The other view is that he took her to Ephesus, where he was the pastor of the church, became the pastor of the church, and she lived with him for a number of years. How many? Nobody knows that. Here's what I would love to have gotten in on. I would have loved to have been sitting there at the table between the 2 of them and listening to John ask her the questions. Now, wait a minute. Tell me about Jesus when he was a little boy. Did he ever fall down and scratch his knee? Did he ever cry? Did he ever get angry? Can you imagine the conversation that the 2 of them had over those years that they talked together? But what I want you to see is this. Jesus' dying moments, he was concerned about his mother. That is the most beautiful expression of love for a mother that I know of. So what I'd like to do is just, I'm going to give you 10 words. They're going to be all on the screen here, just the words. And I want you to think about how you love your mother, and think about it in this way. First of all, you should love her verbally. That is, you should tell her that you do. And you say, well, how often should I tell her? You should tell her every day. If it's possible, you ought to tell her every day that you loved her. As long as I had my mother close by and I could talk to her every day, I'll tell her every day I loved her. And I believe mothers need to hear it. You see, sometimes, and I've heard wives say this, well, I wish my husband I wish he would just tell me he loves me. When I bring it up, he says, well, you know I do. Don't I treat you like I do? No, a woman needs to hear it. She needs to hear you say, I love you. Mothers need to hear their children say, Mom, I love you. And not only say it once, but say it often, but not only just say it that way, but tell her why. If I should ask you this morning, you say you love your mother or you loved her if she's gone. Why did you love her? If someone says to you, I love you, well, that's fine. But then when they say, here's the reason I love you. You're so sweet and kind and loving and tender and considerate and thoughtful and generous to me. In other words, mothers need to understand why we love them. So we love our mothers, first of all, verbally. Secondly, we should love them physically. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, you know, there's some people who do not know how to love. And have you ever hugged anybody, for example? This is a legitimate hugging now. Have you ever hugged anybody and it was like hugging this table, solid rock? I mean, there was nothing emotional in that at all. You got nothing in return. Well, there's some people who are like that. I understand that. You say, well, my mother's one of those hard women. Well, we're to love her anyway, but to love them physically. That is, a mother needs to be touched. Remember this. The first person who touched you the first 9 months of your life was your mother. Nobody touched you for the first 9 months but your mother. And you know, I think mothers deserve to be touched many, many times thereafter. We should hug our mothers. We should not just give them a handshake. I can't imagine walking into my mother's house and saying, hello, Mom. That would not fit her nor myself. A third way we should love them is patiently, because they are not perfect. Mothers are not perfect. God didn't grow up mothers to be perfect. We should be patient with them. And sometimes they're going to say things that maybe we don't necessarily appreciate. But if you'll think about this for a moment, I don't know of anybody who has a greater responsibility than a mother. Let's say here's a mother, whether you got 2 children, 3 children, or 5 or 6 or whatever it might be. When she gets up in the morning, imagine the job that a mother with 3 or 4, 5, 6 children has. And she's thinking about all the children. She's thinking about what they're all going to eat, and they all want something different. And she's going to think about getting them all dressed, and they always want to wear something different. In other words, you think about all the different things that a mother has to think about. And think about this. We expect her to think about all of them and to have the meal on time. We expect her, if she's a working mother, to be able to get everything done before she goes and works 8 hours and comes home. And then, of course, there's dinner. And who's gonna prepare dinner? Most husbands are not gonna do it, probably because they don't know how to cook. But secondly, because they think it's her job. A mother has an awesome responsibility, and we should be patient with them. Then, of course, there is the whole idea of loving them gratefully. Do you love her gratefully? You say, well, I think I do. Well, she's the one who gave you life. And if you love her gratefully, you're going to express that. You're going to be looking for ways. How do I show my mother how grateful I am to her? How do I express my love to her and my gratitude toward her in ways that there's no question in her mind about it? Gratitude works outwardly in expressing what I feel, but it also works inwardly in expressing who I am. I'm either a grateful person or an ungrateful person. And I think it's easy to spot somebody who is ungrateful. And I think about how many times you grew up and you cried and your mother was there. You hurt yourself and she was there. You had some difficult times in your life and she was there. She was always willing to listen to you. You say, well, you're talking about a mother that I don't know anything about. I understand that. I understand there's some mothers who grew up in bad situations, who act just like their mother, who didn't know how to treat them, didn't know how to love them. But you know what? You can change. And the truth is, it doesn't make any difference how they are. I'm still responsible. And I still have a right and I still have a responsibility to be grateful. She gave us our life. And you know what? There's no substitute for that. Love her gratefully. Love her generously. For example, what is it that you have that maybe you ought to share with your mother? How can you have so much and not want to share it with her? Love her generously. I'm not talking about just a Christmas present, but I mean all the time. What can you do for her? You see, if you love her, here's what you'll do. You'll be listening carefully for something that she wants or needs, because she's not going to tell you. Most mothers are not going to say, I've met a few who would, but most mothers are not going to say, well, here's what I need, here's what I want. You know what, those godly mothers, they just go right ahead, and one of these days they'll think, well, maybe I'll have enough money to buy this, or maybe I'll be, you know what, if I love her, my ears are open to figure out, what is it she doesn't have? Look around and see what she doesn't have. Doesn't take much to make a mother happy, because you see, a little bit goes a lot further with a mother than it does with a man. She doesn't have to have a boat and a new rod and reel and all these things. She just needs a few simple things in life. Things that express what? That you're grateful, and that you haven't taken her for granted, and that you haven't overlooked her. Then, of course, we need to love her tenderly. Because you see, that's the way mothers love us. And I think about that. Mothers have tough times in their life, and they don't always feel up to the task. And sometimes they just need us to be thoughtful. That is, be sensitive to what you hear her say and what you don't hear her say. And sometimes I would go see my mother, and I knew when I got there what we were going to do. She'd cook me this big dinner at night, and in fact, she would have cooked me 3 meals a day if I'd have showed up. And I said, I can't do that. But I would go sometimes, and just the two of us would sit down. And we spent some of our most precious times, her on this end of the table, me on this end. Is a small table. And she just wanted to talk. And I knew that she didn't need to hear from me. She just wanted to talk. And some of my most tender moments with my mother was not telling her that I love her, but listening to her tell me what she was thinking about, things that had happened in her past. And the thing that she would oftentimes say to me, I just don't quite figure out why God took Charlie. That was my father at 9 months of age. I just can't figure out why he took him. Well, I heard that many times. Every time she said that to me, I acted like it's the first time I ever heard it. And I'd say, well, why don't we talk about it? Well, we'd already talked about it many times, but you know what? Aren't there some things in your life you don't understand? How many times have you brought up the same subject to somebody? To be tender means I'm going to be sensitive. I want to hear what you have to say. You may have said it 1,000 times. I may even not want to hear what you have to say, but I'm going to listen, and I'm going to be careful how I listen. And here's what I'm going to do. And anybody can do this. You can encourage your mother no matter what's going on in her life. You can encourage her. Then we should love them forgivingly. Now, there are young men and women who look at their mothers and they have things in their mind and heart for which they blame them. And what they say about their mothers may be true, but you can mark this down. There is never, under any condition, an excuse for not forgiving your mother. Now, there are lots of scriptures. We could go through a lot of scriptures for all these, but I wouldn't have time to talk about some of them. But when I think about what Paul said about forgiving, he says, you know, we're to love each other, we're to be forgiving toward each other, but we're to love others and to forgive them as God has in Christ Jesus forgiven us. And when I think about mothers, in other words, what could a mother do that I would not forgive her for? He said, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the earth. And you see, all of us, how many times do you suppose that your mother forgave you? And you think about this. We all grew up in different situations and circumstances in life, and so sometimes people have a much more difficult time than others do. And when you think about, for example, I think about my mother, who stopped school the 6th grade because she saw her mother faint at the well drawing water, and she never went back to school. So she didn't have much education. In fact, 6th grade's all she had. But you know what? It's amazing how wise she was about so many things. And one of the wisest things she ever said to me, and you see, you as a mother can plant into your children's minds and hearts ideas and scriptural truths. And my mother couldn't take the Bible and flip through and say, let's turn to Ephesians chapter 4. Or let's turn to Genesis chapter. She couldn't do that. But somehow she could tell me what it said. One thing she said to me that I'll never forget. She said to me one day, she said, now remember, don't ever do anything you wouldn't want to be doing if Jesus came. Boy, that put a noose around my neck. I mean, but you know what? I'm 77 and I've never forgotten it. Mothers can build into their children awesome truth. And one of the things that my mother built into my heart was to be forgiving no matter what. You forgive no matter what. That's what Jesus says. That's what the Apostle Paul, we forgive no matter what. And it may be that probably most of us need to be asking mothers to forgive us. And I hope after this message, if you've not been kind of son or daughter you ought to be, you ought to call your mother and tell her, you know what, I heard a message today and I realized how much I really love you and I ought to express it and don't express it as I ought to, whatever it might be. Here's something I've noticed about a godly mother. They're so grateful for so little. And oftentimes we take them for granted. Then, of course, to love them devotedly. You defend your mother. When I hear somebody talking about their mother in a negative way, everything in me riles up against that. For the simple reason we're to defend her and protect her, whatever it is, and support her, whatever is necessary. To be devoted to her means that I am interested in the things that she has, the things that she doesn't have, where she's going, and if she's going to be well. In other words, if she is well or if she's, in other words, if I'm devoted to her, she's a big part of my heart and my life. Then, of course, I need to love her cheerfully. And here you say, well, I try to do that. Well, let me tell you one thing you need to do. If you've got something that's hurting you pretty badly, think twice before you dump it on her. So, in other words, a mother wants to hear about your pains and ills and the good things that happen to you, but it's just good if you can be cheerful around your mom and talk about the good things and to make her laugh and to make her happy. Now, let me ask you this. Can't you, if your mother's already gone, can't you visualize right now how she looked when she was happy? When she was smiling, or when she was laughing about something, when she was cheerful about something? We should love them cheerfully. Hug them. Tell them how wonderful they are. Talk about the good things. And talk about all the things that you remember she did for you. And the fun you all had together. And the mistakes you made together. And when you were going through a tough time and how God brought you through that. To bring back wonderful memories in your mother's mind is a gift to her. She loves to think about those things, and especially when it comes to her aging a little bit. Then the last thing I would say is this, and it's all wrapped up in this: love them honorably. You say, well, how do I love my mother honorably? And I believe this is the thing that most honors your mother. Give your mother a godly son. Give your mother a godly daughter. Give your mother godly grandchildren. That honors them. Here's what it says. It says that I poured my life into you. Now you've poured your life into your children. And now look, you're pouring that same life into your grandchildren. And so nothing so honors a mother like seeing her life being continued and poured into those who are coming along. How can you dishonor her? By living in sin, wasting. I think about mothers who see their children, who see their sons or daughters as drunks. Let's call it what it is. Alcoholic, you name it. Drunkards. Or you see them living immorally. Or you see them living wastefully and carelessly and indifferently. And using profane language in the presence of their mother. If you love them honorably, you will ask, if you love them honorably, you begin to look at yourself. How can I best honor my mother? By giving her a godly son, because she's a godly woman. So you put all of those things together, and either it honors her or dishonors her. And I would just ask you what I said in the very beginning. Do you love your mom? How do you love her? When did you tell her last? How did you express it? Do you need to go home and ask her to forgive you? Do you need to go home and just hug her good? In other words, what do you need to do in light of what you just heard about loving your mother? The truth is, every day ought to be Mother's Day. In other words, there's not a single day I should not treat my mother like these 10 things that we talked about. And so it may be that today, if you've never trusted Christ as your Savior, you may be a mother and you've said, you know, I'm not a Christian. How are you going to hand down godly characteristics to your children? You can't until Christ comes into your life. You may be a father here and you're saying, man, I got to go home and do some homework. I need to begin to express to my wife, the mother of my children, how grateful to God I am for her and for who she is. Only you know what you need to say, and I trust that you'll be wise enough and listen. If you're too prideful to say, I'm sorry, if you're too prideful to say, please forgive me, if you're too prideful to say, I haven't been what I ought to be, then my friend, you have a major problem. How many times has God forgiven you? Many times. And I want to encourage you, be the man and the husband you ought to be to your wife, the mother of your children. And be the kind of child you need to be. Young man, young woman, older man, older woman, to your mother. And express to her, if she's alive,